Today I'm at Newcastle University in the UK talking with statistics professor Chris Oates. We'll start by talking about his childhood and a doorbell with a difference before following his career path and talking about his current research.
I was born in Milton Keynes.
Milton Keynes. What an exciting place that is.
Well, indeed. But that was just the closest hospital. I really grew up in Northamptonshire.
Northamptonshire, which is where my wife is from, so it's a place close to my heart. Was that lovely? Were you in like a chocolate box village? And
it's certainly in the countryside. It's a rural area between Daventry, Rugby, Northampton. These are the major towns. But yeah, small villages, just a few thousand people.
Okay. And what were you like as a boy?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't think I was the sort of outgoing type, quite quiet, quite interested in sort of constructive, creative hobbies.
Like what? What sort of stuff would you do?
I think when I was young, I would be into sort of Lego and this kind of thing. I mean, even my son's still into Lego. This is a universally exciting thing to do, right? But as I got a bit older, I'd be interested in things like electronics and soldering little circuits and this kind of hobby that was always appealing to me.
What sort of, can you tell me any of your favourite projects? Do you remember any? Like, did you build like a radio or a remote control car, or what was your marquee project?
Well, I don't know how impressive you're going to find this, but I remember building a little doorbell for my bedroom. So I got the little parts to build the circuit, and I put it in a little housing. I drilled some holes for buttons, and I secured this to my door. And I must have been quite young at the time, but this was very exciting for me.
Like, did people then have to ring that to come into your bedroom?
No. I certainly wasn't holding people accountable to using the doorbell, but I really did love the idea of designing a project and then creating it and then seeing it through to the end. I got a lot of satisfaction from these sorts of things.
You're like a stats guy now. Were you into stats as a kid? Would you like collect cricket statistics or football statistics or other statistics? Did you have notebooks full of numbers and things like that?
No, I don't think I can say I was aware of statistics at all until I ended up studying it at the university. It's not the sort of thing that, there's a huge marketing industry driving statistics education at children, right? You only find out about this stuff if you if you choose to independently seek it out. And I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in watching football. I wasn't interested in counting numbers of goals.
I was obsessed with statistics as a kid, and I kept notebooks of all our scores in our backyard games of cricket, and I'd bring out weekly reports about our batting averages and who was doing what and graphs and all sorts. So statistics was a huge part of my childhood, and now I've got nothing. So if I went in a time machine and went up to you then, when you were still at school and said, what do you want to be when you grow up? What kind of answers was I getting?
I think I would have said an engineer. So the school I went to, the secondary school, it was called Guilsborough, and it was a design and technology specialist school, right? So they had woodworking and electronics and all these things that you could do. And that was my favourite subject. I really enjoyed making things. I remember etching little PCBs and soldering on little 555 timers. I mean, these sorts of technologies are obsolete now, but at the time that was what you did. And I really enjoyed that.
You could have done doorbell installation across all of Northamptonshire.
Well, those rig doorbells, they charge a lot for them, don't they? That could have been me.
Yeah, okay. So as you started moving along in high school, what was your relationship with mathematics like and numbers and that sort of stuff? Well,
I always knew that I could do maths well. And I think I enjoyed it for that. I got some satisfaction from getting high test scores and things, but I never saw it as a career. I don't think that's an obvious career path. I assumed I would be an engineer of some kind.
How did that change? What happened as you got towards the end of school? What happened?
Indecision. So I think if you were to psychoanalyze the decisions I've made in my career, it would just be indecision at every stage, right? So at each stage, I've taken the decision that was keeping my options open. Yeah. So maths is one of these universally applicable subjects, and I knew that I was interested in engineering, but I didn't know if it was civil engineering or mechanical engineering or electronic engineering. And you had to pick to some extent when you went to university which one of those it was you were interested in, and I couldn't. So I thought, well, let's do maths, and then at some point later in my life, maybe I'll know what I want to do and I'll be ready.
So you did mathematics at university, but not thinking you wanted a career in mathematics, just as
Yeah, and even after I'd finished my undergraduate, I still had no idea what I wanted to do, right? So
where did you do that undergraduate?
I did that at Cambridge.
So going and doing mathematics at Cambridge, you're not, that's hardcore. That's proper, serious. That's like, you're obviously pretty good at it. And
I've got reasonably good by working very hard. I certainly wasn't among the best of the best at Cambridge. I mean, they've got some really tremendous students there. But I worked hard and I enjoyed it. And when things went well, I got a lot of satisfaction from that.
What was it like going from mathematics at school to the sort of mathematics you learned at Cambridge? Like, was that exciting, like this whole new world, or was it daunting, or what was that change of gears like?
So it was actually quite a steep and difficult learning curve for me. Just to give you one example, when you start as an undergraduate maths student at Cambridge, you take a course on groups. So groups is kind of the mathematical study of symmetries. The first supervision that I had for my groups module, and I should probably just explain. So in Cambridge, you do some exercises on your own, and then you have what's called a supervision. And that's a small group discussion with an experienced mathematician with typically 2 or 3 students, where you explain what you did and they help you to understand how to do better. And so in this first group's supervision, the way that the concepts were explained were by the supervisor pulling out a whole array of different Rubik's cubes and proceeding to, jumble them up and solve them in a way that appeared just like magic to me. And I had absolutely zero understanding of what was going on and how that explained any of the answers to the questions I was trying to do. So I felt immediately, hugely out of my depth, I would say.
That sounds like they were trying to be really like user-friendly and fun, though. That sounds like it sounds like they were trying to do the right thing, or was it?
I'm sure that they were well-intentioned, and in fact, the people that I was in the supervision with got a lot out of that. But for me, that gap from going from school to university was just way too big. I struggled immediately.
What did you do? How did you catch up, or how did you make the necessary change? What did how did you get around this problem?
I think I have always been very organised and methodical. So for me, I could boil down the course material to the bare bones, and I could pinpoint exactly the bit that I didn't get. And that was very helpful, right? So because math is such a linear subject, if you do miss a step, then you really struggle later on. So you've got to go back. It's like debugging code. You've got to go back and work out which is the bit that was broken or which I didn't understand properly, and go from there. And so by being conscientious and organised, I was able to do that and just about follow along. I wouldn't say I, was an expert on groups by the end of this, but I got through.
Just a quick break to talk about the Lever Hume Trust, who made today's episode possible. The Trust is a charity which supports all kinds of research, including Chris's research, via one of its Philip Lever Hume prizes. One of the things that really sets the Trust apart is its emphasis on blue skies research, all sorts of disparate projects, some of which might surprise you. It also encourages scholarship that generates new ideas, breakthroughs that'll benefit society. I'll include some useful links to the Trust in the notes for this podcast, or you can check out the Lever Hume Trust online. Have a look at some of their past reports, browse the website, you'll be amazed at some of the stuff they're supporting. Really fascinating. And who knows, you might end up being a researcher that receives support from them. Or maybe you'll just be a member of society who benefits from research they backed. Anyway, now, back to Chris. As you progressed through Cambridge doing the mathematics undergraduate, were there any parts of mathematics that started singing to you? Did you hear the siren call of anything? Did you have any favourite subjects?
In a perverse way, my favourite subject at the end was the one that I struggled with the most initially. So this would be called analysis or real analysis. And it's basically formalising the idea of proving things about continuity, right? So if you draw a line with a pen, that's continuous if you don't take your pen off the paper, basically. And intuitively, I totally got what was going on, right? It's sort of obvious. Drawing lines with pens is kind of clear. And what I really struggled with was writing down that intuition in a way that constituted a formal mathematical proof, right? So I'd be submitting my answers to questions and they'd just be getting 0 marks, across the board because I hadn't grasped what it meant to write a formal mathematical proof. And it wasn't until I think probably 2 years into the undergraduate, and it's only a 3-year undergraduate, that I finally twigged what I was supposed to be doing. And once I got the hang of it, there was a huge sense of satisfaction. You spend 2 years banging your head against the wall, and then you finally get something right. You get a lot of satisfaction from that.
Was that more just about you understanding like the notation and what the teachers wanted, or was it a more fundamental understanding of that you had not yet grasped?
Looking back, I think it was probably that I hadn't understood the idea that if a proof is right, it should be like machine checkable, right? So I shouldn't need to use fancy English words to make a point, right? I should just be able to write a series of statements and equations that leads incontrovertibly to the conclusion. I shouldn't need to use any kind of intuition or flowery language to make a point. And I think once I really got the hang of how to do that, how to separate why something is intuitively correct from why it's mathematically correct, then I was able to flourish after that.
So real analysis was a thing you liked?
It was. And, actually, although that was probably my worst subject, or among my worst subjects initially, that's now the thing that I do day to day.
So tell me what happened then. When you finished your undergraduate, where were you at? What did you do next?
So, I said my career trajectory was characterized by indecision. After my undergraduate, I applied for basically everything, right? So I remember applying for a job in a patent office because of this romantic idea that that's what Einstein did.
Okay.
I didn't hear back from that.
You should have sent them some pictures of that doorbell.
What else?
You applied for a patent office?
Yeah. Well, just whatever was out there.
So you were applying for jobs. You weren't applying for postgraduate?
Well, I was applying for everything and everything. I remember there was a really interesting sounding PhD at Exeter being advertised, which was to model the swarming behaviour of fish with a year in Barbados.
Nice.
So obviously I applied for that, did not hear back from that one.
Okay.
I applied for all sorts of things. And the one in particular that came off was something which I didn't really understand, to be honest, but it was called a doctoral training centre in complexity science at the University of Warwick.
Right. What does that mean?
So as I'm sure you know, there are buzzwords that come and go. And we've seen some recently, right? So we had big data for a while. We had digital twins more recently, and if you go back a bit further in time, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, you had this thing called complexity. And complexity science is about the idea that you can have relatively simple, low-level interactions among many different agents that result in quite interesting and complicated emergent global phenomena. So examples of these things are like stock markets or cells in tissue or fish swarming around as it happens.
Yeah.
And I was attracted by this because, again, it was very non-committal, right? So this said there's this broad swathe of different physical, biological, chemical phenomena that can be explained using mathematics. And if you sign up to this doctoral training centre, then you'll do 1 year of courses that will cover just the basics of physics and maths and so on. And then you get to pick a project. And so I was delaying this decision of what I would actually want to do by another year.
So this was a track to a PhD, basically, this centre as well. That's why it's a doctoral training centre.
That's right. So this was one of the first of what's now become the standard model in the UK for PhD funding. The idea is it's cohort-based PhD training. You start your doctoral journey with a dozen or so other students, and you take the training together, you do your PhDs together, of course, obviously on different topics with different supervisors, but having that community is useful for getting an idea of where you should be at with your research.
So you're in Warwick instead of Barbados. I'm sorry about that. What was that like? What was that new location, new work, new things? How did you find that? Did you get into that quickly? Was that hard at first as well? I
really enjoyed it. It's quite a contrast being on the Warwick campus compared to Cambridge, right? So Cambridge, you've got lots of people going around in gowns and things, and everyone is very fancy, and Warwick's much more relaxed, right? So I felt much more comfortable actually at Warwick.
Yeah. What was the work like? You said you had to do this year of kind of acclimatization and courses. Was that hard, easy, or? I
was on that program with people from different backgrounds. So there was economics, there was physics, there was chemistry, there was maths, and we all needed to have a common foundation for this program. So some of the courses that we took were ones that I was quite comfortable with. They were, heavily overlapping with the maths undergraduate I had, but then some I was very uncomfortable with. So in particular, I remember there was a course on the physics of many-bodied systems. It's called statistical mechanics. And the idea is you've got sort of lots of things that interact, and you try and describe the ensemble properties using statistics, essentially. And so I thought, okay, statistics, that's basically maths, isn't it? I can do that. And I thought I knew what was going on, but then I remember the very first example that the lecturer used to illustrate these concepts.
Rubik's Cube? Rubik's Cube?
It wasn't Rubik's Cube.
Okay.
It was even better than Rubik's Cube. So, remember, this is the intuitive example they had. It was the quantum harmonic oscillator. Now, I don't know how much intuition you have about quantum harmonic oscillators, but I didn't have any at all, so I found that quite challenging.
Okay, so once you guys have all got your foundation, what do you do? Do you now specialise in something? Do you choose a PhD topic? Or
That's right. So there's this sort of matchmaking, courting process between supervisors and students. So you often are drawn to the lecturers whose courses you enjoyed the best, but you can effectively pick anyone in the university to be a supervisor. And so there's this...
do they pick you? Who's got the upper hand in this courtship usually? Is it the student or the supervisor?
Well, the students are made to feel like they're very much in charge, but there's certainly a lot of, politicking going on amongst the staff to try and get the strongest students to be the ones that they supervise.
And were you drawn to someone? What was your path?
I managed to get through most of that first year with still no idea what I wanted to do.
Of course.
And I remember having discussions with a few different people. Some were mathematicians who would do things like lattice-based dynamics. So maybe you've heard of the game of life and things like this. So, little toy systems that evolve on lattices and trying to prove mathematically what these systems do. I thought about maybe doing that. I remember thinking... So at the time, there was a mathematician at Warwick called Ian Stewart, who's very famous from popular mathematics, wrote some very nice books. And I thought, well, that'd be fun to work with Ian Stewart, wouldn't it? So I remember sending him an email. I still had no idea what I wanted to do. And I was quite lucky because one of the staff members at the doctoral training centre had been proactive in approaching students. So his name, and he would gone to be my supervisor, was Sash Mukherjee. So he would tap me on the shoulder one day and say, there's actually this very interesting problem in systems biology, which I've got. And I think this is something where new statistical methodology could really help the biologists. And would you be interested? And that was what, steered me towards statistics ultimately.
What was the biological system? What was the thing he wanted you to help him with?
So Sash was working on aspects of cancer pathway signalling. So there's various different causes for cancer, but one of the most well-known ones is dysregulation of certain protein signaling pathways. So protein signaling is a fast response mechanism that a cell uses to respond to changes in environment. So if you think of a cell, on the surface of the cell, there's various different receptors which sense the chemical makeup of the environment. And based on those signals, they can start a cascade of interactions among other proteins inside the cell. And that ultimately leads to changes in genomic transcription and basically, tells the cell whether to divide or to do something else. And in cancer, those systems can become dysregulated, meaning that some of these proteins are overactive and they're driving the cell division really much more than they should be doing. Of course, the goal here is to design targeted therapeutics that can reduce that signaling. But to do so, you need to understand the signaling itself. And so the statistical problems that Sash was interested in was trying to understand if I've got some cells or some tissue that have some sort of dysregulation in their protein signaling, where's that happening? What are the things that are driving that signaling? And where would be the place to target with an intervention?
Is that what you then worked on? Was that your PhD?
That's right. So we started out with a particular cell signaling pathway called the MAP kinase signaling pathway. And this is one of the most fundamental pathways when it comes to cell division. And that really opened up a lot of doors for me. So actually, shortly after I started, Sash took a position in the Netherlands Cancer Institute in Amsterdam. So this was really the place to do this research because it's a cancer biology lab. And if you're a statistician working on applied projects, you really need to be where those data are being collected because you need to understand the process that gives rise to the data and talk to the people that are getting it. So it made a lot of sense for Sash to move there. And I was then faced with this choice of do I stay in Warwick and try and do this PhD remotely somehow, or do I go there? And so I went there. I spent a year there and had a great time, learned a lot. I actually even took some master's courses in oncology. I mean, I'm not sure I remember the details now, but I really dived into that world. And as a result, we got some really nice new data to analyse, and we were able to talk to the cancer biologists about what are the important questions here and how can we help to design methods that take these proteomic data and translate them into scientifically meaningful conclusions.
What is the data they're giving you to work with? Is it like stuff out of test tubes, like, oh, this protein has now gone to 38% and it was 22% yesterday, and the levels of this chemical have gone up and down, or are they data from people? Like, what even is the data?
So that's a good question. I'll try and give a non-technical explanation. So in your cells there are thousands and thousands of proteins, right? So it's a very complicated network of signaling, and just working out which proteins have the propensity to bind to each other and interact is itself a major research problem, right? So working out that two proteins interact and exactly how the molecules stick together, that's one person's entire PhD. So they have to extract those proteins from real cells, and they have to do something like X-ray crystallography to work out what the conformations of those molecules are and can they really stick together. And once all of that has happened, you get essentially a big graph or network where the nodes of that network are different proteins, and the arrows represent the potential for those proteins to interact. So that is essentially all of the things that could happen, and the question is which of these things are actually happening and are driving this overexpression of certain genes that lead to cell division. So the data that we get are measurements of the abundance of different proteins and sort of combinations of those proteins in actual cancer cell line tissue. From those protein abundance measurements, which could be through time as well as for fixed time points, you have to somehow reverse engineer what are the active edges in this network. And
what happened now? You do a year in Amsterdam. Do you finish this PhD? Is that what your PhD is in this?
That's right. So
what was the title of your thesis? Do you remember?
Bayesian inference for protein signaling networks.
You do remember?
I do, yeah. Well, if you spend 3 years on it, you tend to remember, I guess.
Do you remember your Viva?
I do remember my Viva, and the reason I remember is because the external examiner ended up being someone that I worked closely with afterwards.
Okay, you obviously had a good Viva then.
Yes.
All right, so you've got your PhD. Well done. Now what does Mr. Indecision do?
Mr. Indecision comes out again, and the first port of call is to see what are my options, right? And so
patent office.
Well, I don't know. I was probably a bit overqualified now. I think they probably wouldn't want a PhD statistician. I think they probably want someone a bit more fresh-faced.
Okay.
So I looked at what my options were. My sort of easiest options were just to stay where I was, right? So it turned out that people from the statistics department at Warwick were hiring, and these were short-term contracts of 1 or 2 years. I quite like living in Warwick, so I thought, that sounds good. I'll do one of these. And this was a postdoctoral position.
Yeah.
What was and is still known as the Centre for Research in Statistical Methodology at Warwick. It's actually a very famous centre within Warwick. It's produced an enormous number of very famous statisticians, and so it was a nice place to work.
Okay. So that was one option?
That was one option. And
is that the option you took?
That was the first option I applied for. I interviewed and I got it, and I thought, yes, let's do that.
Doing what? Because you're a postdoc. What happens now? Do you keep doing the same area of research? Do you change horses?
Yeah, so that was actually quite tricky, right? Because there are essentially two categories of postdoctoral positions. One is where you're assigned to a certain project with a named supervisor who will steer you in the direction of answering a particular scientific task. And this is typically something that a research council has decided that is important and should be funded. And then the other kind of postdoc is like the one that I had, a postdoctoral fellowship, where you are free to choose what you work on. That would prove to be really nice in the end, but at the start, that was very daunting, right? Because I'd gone from this position where my PhD supervisor would guide me and tell me what is an interesting project and what papers should I try and write, to being given an office and told where the coffee machine was, and you've got 3 years and off you go.
The obvious option must be to stay in the field you're working in and do all this cancer stuff and oncology. Is that what you did, more cancer?
Because I was in Warwick and not in the Netherlands in the cancer hospital, that was always going to be a little bit harder. And I pivoted at that point to doing things that were easier to do on pen and paper in an office, right? So I started working on more abstract kinds of statistical methodology at that point. And I was lucky that there were really nice, friendly, helpful professors in the stats department at that time who would suggest interesting problems that I might like to try and work on. So initially I did one or two things that did build on the experience I had trying to infer these protein signaling networks. So, for example, I worked on brain networks for a little while because the methodological core was very similar. And I pivoted a little bit more towards computation. I think the instinct in me to be an engineer came out a bit again at this point. So I like to develop methods that I could build programs for that would run in some fast time. And I had some early success doing this. I managed to speed up a few different computational tasks in Bayesian statistics, which served as a little bit of a springboard for then what I ended up doing a bit later on.
So in a nutshell, are you basically coming up with techniques and methods, often using computers, that other statisticians can use at the coalface, the people who are actually doing the cancer and the things like that? You're coming up with new tools for them.
That's right, yes. So at this point, I'm now thinking about how can I build general purpose computational solutions to statistical analyses. So, without wishing to get into too many details, there's different types of statistics. Right? And one of these types is Bayesian statistics, but there's others, and they differ on their fundamental philosophical principles. What are the bases for performing inference in the real world from data? Bayesian statistics is conceptually very elegant. There's this thing called Bayes' theorem, which I guess you may even have heard of. It's very famous. And in some sense, and I'm being a bit facetious, but in some sense, the only real challenge is to calculate the conditional distribution of the things you're interested in given the things you measured. And it's that calculation that can be very complicated. So although Bayes' theorem and Bayesian inference had been well known for a very long time, it didn't start to become popular as a statistical methodology until, let's say, the 70s, when there was enough local computing power you could actually try and calculate these conditional distributions.
I've heard of this thing called the postdoc trap, that you become a postdoc and you can't escape and you can't get yourself a real grown-up job. How did you escape that? What happened next for you after your 2 years or whatever at this Warwick Centre?
When you're a postdoc, you get invited to give seminars at other universities, and that's strategic on the part of other universities because they're always looking to recruit the new generation of lecturers, right? So they want to know who's good, and they invite you up and you give a talk, and they.
But it's sort of also a secret audition.
That's right, and being very naive, I had no idea what this was going on. So I gave a few of these talks, and one of those talks was actually at Newcastle. So I was invited by one of our late professors, Richard Boyes, and he was very friendly and took me out for lunch and said, it's a great talk. Oh, by the way, we've got some jobs coming. Have you considered applying? And I said, well, I mean, that's really kind of you, Richard. But actually, I was also interested in going abroad for a little bit. I enjoyed my year in Amsterdam.
Not with any professional goal, just for your own personal development and adventure and things.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife's brother is actually in Australia at this point. So I thought, well, that would be a lovely place to go. My wife was very keen to go because her brother was there. So I'd actually been looking at some postdoctoral positions in Australia. So I said, well, Richard, that's really kind of you, but I've got my heart is set on going to Australia for a little bit. But, maybe one day it'd be great to come back to Newcastle. And he said, well, don't worry, just apply anyway. If we offer you a job, maybe you can just defer it. I thought, well, okay, I can't really say no to that, can I? So I applied, I interviewed, and I was lucky enough to get an offer from Newcastle.
You obviously gave a great seminar here.
But at the same time, I was applying for this job in Sydney, and I got a postdoctoral position at the University of Technology in Sydney. I was very, very keen to do that, and Newcastle were kind enough to let me defer the position at Newcastle. So I went off to Sydney, had this lovely 2-year postdoc, really enjoyed that, and I had this security of a job for when I got back to the UK.
Brilliant. Okay. And that's where we're sitting now, in Newcastle.
That's right.
Tell me what it is you do now then. Tell me all the different levels, right? First of all, you're in the pub for a party or something and you meet someone who's not interested in statistics or numbers. They know nothing about you and they just say, what do you do? What's your job? How do you give them the in the pub stranger answer?
So people like to talk about tangible things, don't they? And so I've always got an application that I can wheel out for these sorts of things, right? And that will change every 6 months or so because I like to, keep things fresh. But just to give you an example of this, obviously when I was a PhD student, protein signaling cancer, if you ask my sort of extended family, they say, oh, he works on cancer.
Okay.
Didn't really.
But what's your first answer when someone says, hey, what do you do? What's your job? What do you just say? I'm a professor of statistics, or?
I never introduced myself as a professor because then people always make a judgment. Do you look like a professor? And I guess I maybe don't look like a professor.
You look a little bit young for a professor, but you're all right.
Well, so I first became a professor when I was 30, and I would often get mistaken for a student at that point.
Yeah.
That was very embarrassing for everyone. So
Wow.
that's why I didn't use the word professor.
So if you don't say professor, what do you say? What do you say to that person in the pub?
I say that I'm a lecturer, or I give lectures in statistics. I teach at the university.
I teach at the university. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, you're a teacher at the university. What do you teach?
Well, then I would say statistics, and then
And what do they think? What's the most common question then? What's the preconception of a lecturer in statistics that you have found?
I think people are always a little bit awkward at this point, right? Because it's a very technical subject, and I think people worry that maybe they don't know enough about maths or statistics to sort of have a meaningful conversation. But I try and preempt this by saying, but this is normally a conversation killer. Let's talk about something else.
Right, okay. Well, and they'll say to you, I was terrible at maths at school.
That's a very common thing you hear, isn't it?
Yes. Okay, but if they do probe a bit further, you said you've got an example that you might wheel out to help them better understand what you do?
So I'm lucky I've got a few of these things. Actually, so when I came back from Sydney, I didn't come straight to Newcastle. I actually spent 3 more years in London. And while I was there, I was at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK National Institute for Data Science and AI. So while I was at Turing, I was able to work on a few different things, which are all quite kind of interesting projects. So one of them, for example, was the idea of using a robot arm with a welder stuck on the end to 3D print steel structures. So this was why
do they need a statistics guy for that?
Okay, so to set the scene, there's a reason for why you'd want to 3D print steel, right? And it's because it gives you huge flexibility, you can reduce the amount of the material that you use, and you can also do some fancy artistic things. The reason why we're not doing that across the board is that every time you press print, effectively, you get a slightly different output. And that's because actually the process of welding is really complicated. So it depends on the ambient temperature and the heat of the weld itself and how quickly it cools and so on. So each time you do some welding, you get a slightly different shape, right? You've probably seen welds on the sides of engineering structures before, and sort of bumpy things, right?
So, a bit messy.
Yeah, you can imagine if you're trying to sort of build. In this case, it was a pedestrian bridge. If you're trying to build a pedestrian bridge with effectively a stick in blue tack on top of it, it's not going to be a lovely smooth solid structure, and the mechanical properties will change dramatically as a result of that. So these kind of wiggles in the printed structure correspond to varying thickness across the piece, and that's going to change the load-bearing capacity of this pedestrian bridge in this example. So where does the statistics come in? Well, you want to know 2 things really. If I'm going to build this structure, what's the likelihood that it's going to be strong enough to do what it's supposed to do? And the randomness here comes from the fact that every time you print, you get a slightly different structure. So we're talking generative modeling for 3D printing. And the second question is, well, given that I have actually built this structure, how can we validate it? How can we certify that it's actually going to do the job that it's supposed to do? So we've got to apply some loadings, we've got to measure deflection, we've got to infer what that is saying about the mechanical properties of the thing we've actually built.
Okay, so we're back at the pub now. You'll tell someone, I do the statistics of building bridges. I make bridges safer. That's how you would make it seem applicable?
Yeah, I think people like examples like this, don't they?
Yeah.
Another one I like to roll out is cardiac modelling. So I've had a collaboration over many years now with a cardiac research team at Imperial College London. And what they do is they build computational models of the human heart. So it's a really impressive modelling effort. And what they want to be able to use is clinical data that can be calibrated against the model in order to predict what treatments will have the best outcome for patients. So that's their long-term goal. But there's lots of really interesting statistics in there, as you can imagine. So one is just the classical problem of you've got some model with some parameters, and how do you fit those parameters to the data that you've got from the patient? But then another one, and it's one that I'm much more interested in, is, well, actually, these models are so expensive. They run on supercomputers, right? So one of the UK national supercomputers is called Archer. A typical configuration of this heart model is to use 512 cores of Archer for 4 hours just to simulate a few heartbeats, right? So this is a hugely expensive procedure. And it's because there's lots of stuff going on. There's the cell scale signaling, there's the tissue level physiology, and then there's the organ itself, right? And the mechanical moving of the atrium and the ventricles as they squirt the blood and so on. So all of that to be simulated accurately requires very precise numerical methods, each with very small tolerances or put another way, high fidelity simulations. And that means they're so slow. What I'm sort of more interested in is how do you speed these things up? How do you work with approximate but faster simulations of this model in order to, actually implement this idea of comparing the model output to the data, right? Because you've got to simulate from different configurations of the model parameters to see which ones are going to match the data in the first place.
So things like cancer and bridges and hearts are some of your, not greatest hits, but maybe easiest to explain hits. What are you actually doing at the moment? What's your bread and butter, or what's the thing that's really consuming your head at the moment? What's your area of research?
So that's much more abstract. I'm interested in computational methods that have some kind of optimality problem. For example, if you are trying to approximate a probability distribution. So you can think of, you're trying to do Bayesian statistics, you've got Bayes' theorem, that tells you what the conditional distribution of some quantity you're interested in, given things that you can measure, is. But you need to numerically approximate that somehow because it's given to you indirectly through Bayes' theorem. It's not given to you explicitly. There are lots of different ways you can do that. And for me, the most kind of exciting ways are ways that try and set up an optimization problem whose solution is this distribution you care about, right? And then you can apply principal techniques from optimization to try and provably converge on a solution to this. So I'm sort of trying to develop computational methods, but from a motivation of their mathematical elegance.
So presumably you're hoping and occasionally already coming up with new ideas, little breakthroughs and things to advance the field you're in. How do you do that? What does that look like? How do you have your ideas and breakthroughs? Do you do them when you're out on a run or in the shower, or do you do them when you're sitting with a notepad and paper, or when you're bashing a keyboard and playing with code? What does your actual research and process look like?
Yeah, I think, that sounds like there's this sort of flash of inspiration, right? And then everything follows from that. For me, I don't think that's really the case. I think the good ideas that I have tend to kind of emerge slowly and iteratively. But you have to be doing something like that to iterate upon. What's the thing you're doing? So I think talking with people, right? So, I think when you hear what people are doing, and you can bring your own perspective to that, you very often end up with something that's new and interesting, right? So I've been working for a long time on an area called probabilistic numerics. And so I think this is independently a very interesting area where you're trying to use ideas from statistics and probability to solve numerical problems, like simulating some physics, for example. That's quite an unusual area to work in. And so with this background, when I go and see other talks, typically in applications or in statistical methodology, I've got some background that other people don't necessarily have, and I can see new ways to adapt and potentially improve methods just from having conversations and bringing this different perspective to bear on what people are working on.
I think I have a preconception about statistics, probably because I base it on things like cricket statistics, where you just take the number of runs someone scores and divide it by the number of innings, and that's their average. And it's all quite simple, it's quite simple things, or things we do in a spreadsheet. And probability even I think of as being reasonably simple, because I think of, gambling and horse races and, and the weather and things like that. It's a 20% chance it's going to rain and things like that. Yeah. Talking to people like you makes me realise statistics is a very, very complex thing.
Yeah. So what's going on there is we're contrasting aleatoric uncertainty, which is the uncertainty of just having a finite amount of data, versus epistemic uncertainty. So epistemic uncertainty is being uncertain because you don't know something, right? So let me give you an example of this. So when physicists try and reason about the nature of the early universe, they write down some equations and then they simulate on a computer, right? So they actually build very large-scale simulations of the universe, starting from the Big Bang and expanding out. And then they can compare what they end up with to what you can actually see in the sky. And that validates or invalidates some aspects of the theory. That's the kind of aleatoric thing, comparing the data to the model. But there's epistemic uncertainty all the way through this, right? So the model they build is wrong in some way that we don't know, right? So there's some sort of unknown model misspecification. But there's also errors that are due to numerical simulation errors, right? So if you're going to implement physics on a computer, you have to discretize space and discretize time. And every time step that you evolve the simulation introduces more discretization error, and that will accumulate and propagate through the simulation in a really complicated way. So what you're going to end up with is comparing something that comes out of a simulator, which will be distributions of galaxies across the sky, against data, but that simulation is not what your equations were telling you, right? So through the artifacts of discretization error that accumulate and propagate, you're going to have spurious galaxy formulations appearing somewhere in the simulated universe that actually were not driven by the physical equations you wrote down to start with. They're just artifacts of numerical simulation. And there's a big and interesting issue of epistemic uncertainty here, because I don't even know what the consequences of my physical equations were. I've simulated something, but it's not what the equations told me. And now I've got to compare that to the data. So you see there's these two sources of uncertainty, the aleatoric uncertainty of having just finite data, but also the epistemic uncertainty of not even knowing how to do this thing in the first place.
Well, that's where you guys hope to come in, is it?
Well, I hope so. One of the things I've really been pushing with some colleagues is the idea that you should try and quantify epistemic uncertainty in numerical simulation fairly routinely, right? So if you're trying to simulate a complicated system of equations, then you're going to face numerical problems unless you do, what these cardiac modelers do, which is to use huge supercomputer resources to really drive down the numerical error to negligible levels. You're going to have to accept some level of numerical error. And assuming you're simulating something that's not totally trivial, then that numerical error is going to manifest in a sort of confusing way, right? So we had this example of the early universe. What if there was numerical error in the cardiac model? Well, then you'd have, simulated ECG signals that look a bit different from what the model originally on pen and paper would be predicting. And that could, lead to misinterpretation of how the patient will respond to treatment and all sorts of side effects.
I feel like most fields of endeavour have white whales or holy grails and things like that. What is there in your little lane? Like, what's ahead? What's the thing you'd love to see someone break through? Maybe you. What's the thing?
Yeah. So here's what I think is one of the biggest problems now, and I should preface this by saying that not many people are talking about this. It might just be me, so I might be alone in thinking this is a big problem. But I see a huge political momentum behind building extremely complicated models. Right. So you might have heard of this phrase, digital twins. There's been a huge political momentum behind the idea of building a digital twin of some really important things, right? So cities, patients in hospital, nuclear power plants. There's been millions and millions of pounds invested and thousands of research hours into building these complicated models of these important assets.
Well, almost like as a simulation or
exactly.
Like a parallel simulation.
Yeah. So you'd like to know, how would a city respond to, say, a terrorist attack or a flood or something like this? And if the idea is, at least as it's sold by politicians, that if you have a sufficiently detailed model, then that would allow you to make these kind of causal predictions and then to design appropriate responses. But there's a huge challenge here, which I think is not acknowledged. Well, there are two huge challenges, actually. So one is, first of all, this goes completely against statistical reasoning that you should match the complexity of your model to the data, right? So there's no point building a big, complicated model if you haven't got the data to accurately train it. But let's leave that aside. The issue that I see as being really, really important is that what comes out of these models depends in a very non-trivial way on the fidelity of each of the discretizations that happens in translating what's typically a continuous time, continuous space description of the real world into something that runs on a computer.
Right.
If we take those cardiac models as an example, we're talking, maybe a dozen or so different levers that have to be set in some way to specify how accurate the simulation is. So you've got spatial discretizations of the shape of the heart, right? So you don't represent the heart in a continuous way. You discretize it by coming up with a triangulation or something like this. You've also got time steps and various other settings. And the way that you balance these is almost always through trial and error, right? So the systems are so complicated that you can't possibly do numerical analysis, the mathematical study of how discretization errors affect simulation. That's just not possible with these digital twins due to the scale that they're designed on. So what people do is typically, explore the effect of increasing or decreasing each of these levers one at a time. And through luck or possibly some judgment, they try and set these things to some default settings, which are then fixed for eternity. What I consider to be a really important problem is trying to learn suitable values for each of these levers in a data-driven way. So what I'd like to do is to effectively cast the problem of numerical simulation as a prediction problem, and specifically an extrapolation problem. Can I extrapolate what that digital twin would do if I set all of these fidelities to, as high as possible, if I set all the levers to full power. Of course, I can't do that. I haven't got the compute resources to do that. But can I predict what that simulation would look like based on cheaper simulations at lower resolutions that I can afford to run?
That's what you want to do. Is that what you're working?
That is what I'm working on at the moment. It's one of the things I'm working on.
Has it got a name? Has that? What do you call that?
Well, so this is the thing, right? Pretty much everything, if you think about it, is just extrapolation. Okay. So in this case, it's extrapolating the output of some complicated simulator as all of the different numerical fidelities are set to, high or infinite values. Pretty much everything's extrapolation. There's survival analysis for patients in medical statistics. That's just extrapolation, how long someone's going to live. Extrapolation is, it's everywhere. It's the generalization error in machine learning. If I take some trained machine learning method and apply it to some context where it wasn't trained, is that going to work? That's extrapolation. Really, extrapolation underpins anything. And if you look in the maths literature, the most famous extrapolation method is called Richardson extrapolation. It was invented about 100 years ago by Lewis Fry Richardson, who incidentally grew up in Newcastle, where we are right now.
Okay.
So a local hero. And the idea is very simple. You just measure some data and you fit a polynomial and then you extrapolate the polynomial. That's all it is. But the nice thing about Richardson extrapolation is that idea itself is very generalizable, right? So you don't need to fit polynomials, you could fit something else. You don't need to work in one dimension, you could work in many dimensions. And so part of what I've been trying to do is to reinvent Richardson extrapolation, let's say for the 21st century, with a statistical uncertainty quantification on top. So instead of just extrapolating a curve to get a point estimate for what I'm interested in, we can actually do this with error bars in some sense. And those error bars are encoding epistemic uncertainty, the uncertainty of just not knowing.
So the thing that's been extrapolated in your world is, can I extrapolate the lever positions from my lower grain coarser model and have them still work on the super duper digital twin model?
That's right. So the goal here would be to perform simulations of let's say, from a cardiac model at fidelities that are low enough that I can do them without recourse to national UK supercomputing resources, but extrapolate with probabilistic error bars what that high fidelity simulation would have been. You might even have heard of a machine learning task called super resolution, where you're given a low fidelity image and you're trying to reconstruct the high fidelity image. And that's extrapolation again. Extrapolation is everywhere. In painting as well. So you've seen these features on your phone where you rub out something in the picture you don't want and you try and fill in the gaps. I mean, it's not extrapolation so much as interpolation, but who is to say what's inside and what's outside? I think extrapolation and interpolation are almost interchangeable terms, really.
Let me ask you one more question. What kind of doorbell do you have on your house now? Is that a nice one?
We have a doorbell that has a variety of changeable melodies.
Really?
And my children enjoy changing the melody. We've got a special happy birthday melody. So when it's a birthday, we'll put the happy birthday melody on.
Okay.
At the moment, we've got some cuckoo sounds. So,
nice. Is it off the shelf, or have you done some tweaking on it?
Oh, I wish I had the time to do that. No, I get very excited because I do own a soldering iron still.
Right.
And I actually got to use it last weekend. So before we had kids, I had a lot more time for this sort of thing, right? So I also have a guitar, which I barely played since we had kids. But the guitar was broken. And I actually managed to turn into an activity with my 2-year-old that we would take the guitar apart, we would remove the barrel jack, basically the bit you plug the wire into, which had some problems. So we put a new one in and I soldered it together, and that was an activity that combined the two hobbies that I really love to do with my childcare. So it was the perfect activity, really.
Love it. Thanks for listening to today's episode, and to the Lever Hume Trust for supporting it. Numberphile is also grateful to Jane Street and Ben Delo for supporting us. And to all our Patreon supporters whose names you can find listed on the Numberphile website. I'm Brady Harron, and I'll be back soon with more episodes.